You can take it away.
Good afternoon and welcome to StockTalk. My name is Sean Kabak and I will be your host along with Pam Iwanchisco and Aaron Dieterle, who will be assisting. Manitoba Agriculture has been holding monthly livestock and forage webinars since December, and today will be the final one of the season. We're glad you can join us for today's presentations, which will be recorded so you can view them at a future date. If you have any questions during the presentations, you can type them into your computer and we will answer them after the presentation. Last month on StockTalk, we had two really good presentations, one on bull soundness evaluation from Deanne Wilkinson, Manitoba Ag's extension vet, and a bull buying and selection tips talk by Andrea Berthollet, a Manitoba Ag livestock and forage specialist in Killarney. If you missed these presentations, you can go back and watch the recording on StockTalk. The province came out with their latest flood outlook on Tuesday. Other than a major flood risk for the Red River between Emerson and the Red River Floodway Inlet, the flood risk remains low to moderate in the Interlake region, along the Fisher and Icelandic rivers, and along the Assiniboine River. The risk of spring flooding is generally low along several other rivers, including the Souris, Roseau, Rat, and Pembina rivers. With the exceptions of Dauphin Lake and Lake St. Martin, most of Manitoba's lakes, including Lake Winnipeg and Lake Manitoba, are projected to remain within operating ranges after the spring runoff. The province and the feds just announced $221 million in funding for a 5-year strategic ag initiative in Manitoba under the new Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership. There will be a new resilient ag landscape program that supports ecological goods and services by funding on-farm projects that remove carbon from the atmosphere to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These programs will be offered through the BMP Environmental Farm Plan program, as well as the watersheds. Plus, there is existing Prairie Watershed Climate Program dollars for BMP funding for rotational grazing, cover crops, or nitrogen management through the watersheds. So it looks like there is and will be some very beneficial forage and pasture programs for producers, so stay tuned for more details. With last week's snowstorm and cooler weather, there were few signs of spring, but with the warm weather this week, the snow is quickly disappearing and the runoff has begun. That has producers starting to think about their pasture and forage requirements. To provide timely info on pasture and forage management, we have Annalise Walker with us. Lise has been involved in the farming community since 2005 and now farms in central Minnesota with her husband. She is currently a member of the Grazing Success Team with Maya Grazing and supports farmers and ranchers across North America in leveraging Maya Grazing to make data-driven decisions. In her presentation on forage and pasture management, making grazing records work for you, she will discuss how to use records to optimize grazing management. I would like to welcome Lise.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you guys for hosting us. As Sean was talking about, we're going to be, or as Sean had explained, we'll be talking about forage and pasture management. I'm located just south of everyone, so imported for the purpose of this webinar, and I'm really excited to be here. This is me, and this is my husband and our Australian Shepherd, Raymond. So today we're going to be talking about record keeping. So why do we do it and how it can change depending on your context. We'll also talk a little bit about what grazing records can look like and how we can use them to do short-term and long-term decision making. So first things first, let's just establish a little bit about record keeping, the whys and hows. So why do we keep records? At its foundation, I believe record keeping is really so we can ask better questions. So historical performance, did we achieve our optimal outcomes? Where can we improve? Inventory is what do we have now and how will we use it? And then scenario checking. So given our current position and potential seasonal scenarios, what can and should we do? Or can we and should we do the thing that we're thinking about doing? Common record examples include financial records. So is this actually making financial and economic sense? Livestock records can look like breeding, recent treatments, age. So we're insofar as breeding, we're talking about not just like genetic lines, but also like when did it happen? When are we going to be calving next? Treatments are, things like topical dewormers, salts, things like that, that sort of impact our gross margin. And then age. So as we're talking about the cow depreciation curve, things like that can help us or can help assist us in how to make better, better decisions in so far as what we're going to sell. Today, we'll be talking a lot about grazing records. So grazing charts are very common in holistic grazing or ranching for profit grazing businesses, and then historical production records. So you can kind of talk about, or you can look at how your pastures have been performing. And last but not least, rainfall records. So the amount that you've gotten and the timing of when that occurred. So food for thought, there are a lot of people who do recreational record keeping. So and what I mean by that when I say that is records that you keep should provide information relevant to your optimum outcome. So if you're recording where you've been, how long you were there, but you never actually look back at those records that you're taking to make future decisions, you could save time by just not keeping the records at all if they're not going to advise how you're going to change things. Oops. So introduction to grazing records. So what do those grazing records look like? So traditionally, a lot of records are kept on paper. So it can be a pocket notebook, it can be written on a calendar, or it can be a grazing chart. So a written grazing chart on the lower left-hand corner. This is an example of what a grazing chart could look like. Typical electronic records, and I use air quotes there because it can differ between different platforms, but digital grazing charts are a fantastic way to visualize how long you've been in an area, how much you took, that kind of a thing. Pasture performance, so how much did you take per acre, and livestock density, so either looking at weight per acre or consumption per acre. And then your long-term stocking rate. So how many animals am I carrying over a given time period? Usually looking at roughly a year. So how do records create value, right? So if you're going to be spending time, energy, and emotional frustration on doing something, you want to make sure it's going to create value for your business. So in that vein, first we're going to evaluate historical performance. So what pastures are your highest producing? Where were you grazing last year? And how did your livestock perform? So are you meeting your goals for like gains? Is there something that needs to happen? So if you have some pastures that are carrying the entire ranch and others that are underperforming, you can start thinking about what do I need to do for planning for future performance to identify and address over or underutilized resources. Address your limiting factors. So I have a lot of residual feed that I'm leaving behind because of lack of water access. How can we address that limiting factor? You can estimate potential performance. So if I add these additional watering points, how much could I estimate that I would increase that utilization and therefore overall performance? And then plan rotations to optimize recovery and increase utilization. So if you have cool season dominant pastures versus warm season dominant pastures, how can you graze those in a rotation that makes sense for your ecosystem so that those plants have enough time to recover so you can get multiple grazes out of the same pasture in the same year? So short-term versus long-term decision-making, what does that look like? So in the short term, usually where I tend to start out with most producers is to evaluate your inventory. So you have the supply of your grass versus the demand of your cattle. That's where we're going to spend most of our time today. So when evaluating your forage supply, this is usually going to be represented in one of these different units. So pounds of dry matter per acre, animal days per acre, kilograms of dry matter per hectare, just depending on what your grazing language is. You can use this time. So as you're evaluating how much forage you have, you would evaluate the condition of your forage. Is your forage appropriate for the species or for the class? So if you have growing cattle, they're going to need something with a higher brix content. They're going to need something with a higher protein to achieve that 2 pounds of gain per head per day. This inventory should only include grazable forage, not residual, and we'll talk about that in a second. Common evaluation methods look a lot like using a grazing stick. So that's typically what I use. So it's a stick that you can use to estimate how many pounds of dry matter per acre that pasture is producing. Another version is the step off method. So you're going to step off a square area. This is how much I'm going to need to feed this animal for a day. And then we can extrapolate how much on average is available per acre in that area. And last but not least, the clip and weigh. So the clip and weigh is a really good way to kind of understand your total forage, and then you can extrapolate back like what your utilization rate would be based on the species and density that is there. But I would say it's a lot less common for most producers to use the clip and weigh method. It's a lot more common for like for a government agency to use that. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to establish is sort of something like this great burn down chart. So how many days of forage do I have available? So a brief note on your residual. So don't look at residual as what's left behind. That mentality tends to lead towards chronic overgrazing. So management intensive chronic overgrazing, but rather we should look at that residual as something that we owe to the ecosystem for being there. So when we're looking at your residual versus your stockpile versus your available forage, again, that available forage, this is what your cow can harvest. Or this is what your ruminant, so if you're doing goats, cattle, sheep, horses, whatever, this available forage is what you can take without negatively impacting your ecosystem. Stockpile is anything that you are holding aside for a non-growing season grazing plan. So if you're growing forage for the purpose of being able to extend your grazing into the winter, so either you can graze for more days out of the year, thus increasing your gross margin per animal, or you're trying to just keep that on there for other reasons, so improving your landscapes, that kind of a thing. That's what your stockpile would be for. And last but not least, your residual. So again, that your residual is there to protect your soils, to make sure that there's good soil cover, that you can have that water infiltration rate, that there is something there for keeping a functioning mineral, water, organic or carbon cycle, so that you can maintain soil health and or increase soil health and therefore increase your overall production over time. So short term, evaluating your forage demand. So your total forage demand is essentially the sum of the animals that are grazing on your property and like their daily demand. So this should represent the inventory of like everything that's going to be impacting your landscape, regardless of if they're in separate groups or if they're in a similar group. So when you're looking at total forage demand versus total forage supply, we're looking at everything available versus everything that's taking from what's available. We do have, so in an electronic grazing system, it does give you the option to take a look at your total grazing demand right on your dashboard and your total head numbers. So you can kind of see where you're at and at a glance, and you can start calculating some of these things. So common evaluation methods. A lot of people don't actually know what their cattle weigh, and that's entirely common, and it's okay. So a couple of ways that you can do that is to scale representative groups of animals. So if you're bringing them in to tag them, strip them, do whatever with them, processing them for whatever reason, throw them across a scale to get a good average live weight on them, and then we can extrapolate what the rest of the herd should be taking based on those numbers. If you don't have a scale on your property, there's the good old weigh them in a trailer when it's full and then weigh them in a trailer when it's empty, and then whatever that difference is the total weight, and you divide it by the number of animals that were in the trailer. So that's a good way to get a horseshoes and hand grenades evaluation of like total live weight. If you live in an area that is so rural that you cannot get to a scale, you can eyeball it and finesse it over time. I would say it's better to have a sort of average estimation than it is to have no estimation at all. So from a numbers game aspect, so this is kind of a big slide. So from a numbers aspect, how do we actually calculate that forage supply versus your forage demand? So first, we're going to start out with your areas that you're doing your forage observations. So we have pasture 1, 2, and 3. We went out and we did some forage estimations. So 7 animal days per acre for that pasture 1, 4 animal days per acre for pasture 2, and 9 animal days per acre for pasture 3. If we multiply the number of acres by the forage available, you get your total supply per pasture. And then if we sum that up, that gives us the sum of all animal days that we have available in these 3 pastures for the purposes of grazing. So on the flip side and our demand side, we have our livestock here. So if I have 170 cows that are rated at 1.2 animal units, so they're 170 lactating 1,200 pound cows, the total demand of that stock class is going to be 204 animal units. The H2s or heifers that are on their first calf heifers, you'll have 40 head. They're going to be roughly 1,000 pounds. They also have calves, so they're lactating, so they are 40 animal units. So the total demand of this 110 head is actually 244 animal units. So that's going to be represented what they're taking, the herd is taking daily. So if we take our total forage supply, so that's 766.8 or 7,668 animal days, divide it by our 244 animal units, that gives us 31.4 grazing days remaining, assuming no regrowth. So we can come up with a rotation through these 3 pastures that lasts roughly 30 days, or we can destock and essentially double our grazing period. So that's the basic in and outs of a miniature grazing plan. There is a lot more, there's a lot more out there on how to create your cells and what different things impact your planning and so forth. But essentially at its at its foundation, graze planning is a budget of grass for cattle, or I should say ruminants. It creates an internal expectation for performance. So there's your planned, and then there's your actual. So as you're going through your plan, if you're taking more than you originally anticipated, then that's of course going to extend your grazing plan. So you can start finessing your eye and finessing your plan to ensure that you're optimizing the resource without negatively impacting the resource. You can also identify pinch points to create a contingency plan. So as a wife that has a husband that grazes cattle, I can tell you that when there's moves scheduled, when we have family things going on, I find it quite annoying. So for the people part of your planning process, creating a grazing plan that actually fits the context of your family life can be a really great way to add a sort of more well-rounded planning process to your family, and just to like increase your overall like mental health and well-being. Outcomes include leaving appropriate residual. So management intensive grazing is management intensive, but you're not going to end up, or the goal is not to overuse a resource, right? It is to use a resource within the context of like the season and how much should be left behind. It also allows you to create a unified plan with trigger points. So if you're going through a plan and you're getting less forage than you originally anticipated, then you can say, okay, we need to reevaluate and perhaps destock or find additional land, or do, buy in some substitution feed sources. Like it helps you have those conversations, those hard conversations, but it's about the numbers, not the feelings. Now, long-term forecasting is more of a long-term decision-making tool. So essentially what we're doing there is we're leveraging historical performance to check potential weather and stocking scenarios. Again, it helps you identify pinch points and create contingency plans. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the next couple of slides. It does allow you to destock before the market floods. So of course, during a drought cycle, usually during Q2 is when we're looking at, oh gosh, we don't have enough feed. And so right at the end of the second quarter, so that June, July is when everybody and their cousin starts destocking. If you have a forecast committed, you can destock before the market tanks, or restock to appropriate levels once that drought goes away. So before we start doing any type of long-term forecasting or long-term scenario checking, the first thing we're going to want to do is check our carrying capacity. Now, traditionally, your carrying capacity is representative of just your annual yield per acre. It's a pretty, it's a flexible number. And so one of the best ways that we can actually accommodate the flexibility of a land bases, carrying capacity is actually to look at it as a function of its precipitation. So on the left-hand side here, this is 3 different production levels based on different weather scenarios. So an unfavorable year is a year that is 25% below average. And then we have your straight average and we have your favorable year. So 8 animal days produced on an unfavorable year, 19 animal days produced on a favorable year. Now, if we divide those forage observation or those annual yields per acre by the precipitation values that fell during those years, our carrying capacity actually is fairly similar. So on an average year, you can carry 0.8 animal days per acre per inch of rainfall. It only shifts slightly up from your favorable versus your unfavorable year, you're at 0.65. So there's a little bit of a difference between an average and an unfavorable year. So if we just set a carrying capacity based on that rainfall scenario, it allows you to sort of look at that long-term stocking scenario. So when we're looking at these are 2 different graphs that you can find in my Grazing. The top one is my personal favorite. So the blue bars are going to be your monthly rainfall values. So those are values that you're putting into the system. The green or the blue line is going to be your rolling rainfall. So how much rain has fallen in the last 365 days. This updates daily, again, based on the observations that you're putting into the system. The black line is that carrying capacity that we just calculated on the previous slide. And then the green line is representative of what you've taken per acre per inch as a rolling value. So again, that in the last 365 days, how much have you taken per acre per inch of rainfall? So it's incredibly flexible. So when we're forecasting in this golden area, this is future forecasting. So looking in the future, it looks like we're running at roughly 50% of our carrying capacity. Now, when we take that into context with how we've been performing in recent months, this is looking at your overstocked versus understocked graph. So if it's red, that means you're overstocked. If it's blue, that means you're understocked. So it's not uncommon for your long-term stocking rate to sort of dip and dive above and below your carrying capacity. What we want to avoid is this long-term overstocking. So overstocking, what is it? Why do we want to avoid it? So in the short term overstocking can decrease animal performance. So looking at rate of gain, your reproduction rates, increase in pest pressure, which would then of course increase gross margin, or I'm sorry, decrease gross margin because you'd have to have more inputs to address those issues. Long-term overstocking is a lot more severe. So you're going to have the same issues as your short-term overstocking, but then you're going to have issues with loss of plant cover, soil erosion, decrease in biodiversity, increase in direct cost. You're looking at decreasing in your financial resilience, and then a potential extreme recovery period, there would be a need for an extension of your recovery period because the plants are so degraded. So this is where your stocking policy comes into play. I'm not going to talk a ton about what is in a stocking policy, but essentially the 2 different types of stocking policies are your conservative stocking policies, where you carry the same amount of animals every single year. But in the bad years, you're carrying, you're sort of eating into your reserves. On the average years, you're gaining excess forage, and your excess forage in the good years, you have, you're also gaining excess forage. So where are we stockpiling? With a flexible stocking policy, essentially on your bad years, you're asking who are we removing during your average years, and your really good years, you're using that forage with additional animals. So who are we going to add to this property? What makes sense to carry and what's going to be most profitable? So, really, at the end of the day, you manage your inventories to your strengths. So you're balancing our supply, our demand, and our finances to ensure that all 3 are healthy, happy, and well taken care of. At the end of the day, the biggest contributing factor is going to the management of your time. So it's either going to be how you're managing or how you're managing your landscapes that are going to overall increase the financial and economical and ecosystem resilience of your property. And with that, I feel like I talked a little bit like an auctioneer, but if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out at this time.
Annalise, I have a question for you with regards to someone who's trying to set up a grazing plan or a grazing system and is starting from scratch where they've been continuous grazing for numerous years. What would you suggest? What would be their stepping stone or their starting point?
That's a great question. So if I could, so where I would start out with first is I would create a map of your property. So what that can look like, so this is an example of a map. You can do it in Google Earth. You don't have to do it in Maya, but do it in Google Earth. First, put all your perimeter fences in. How is it shaped? Where is it in the landscape? Next, I would map out all of my resources. Where are my watering points? What are my natural barriers? What areas are degraded? Like really think about how it's set up spatially. Next, I would identify pastures that have perhaps been underutilized. So if that means going out and doing some forage observations in like 4 of the pastures, start there. Okay, what does this look like? If you have availability of like polywire or something you can split the pasture in half really easily, you don't have to do 5-strand barbed wire to subdivide a pasture. Like you can just put up a temporary line. Some of the pastures that we manage will have a 3-strand barbed wire, a 3-strand high tensile wire with electric on it. But our internal like fencing is single high tensile wire that is hot as snot. And they will learn over like 2 or 3 weeks that like that one single line will keep them in as long as it's hot. So start out with 1 or 2 pastures and just subdivide them and then start moving them daily or moving them every 3 days. Whatever is most achievable for you. But I would make sure, so water is typically the most limiting factor. So design your cells around water access. I guess I do want to note there is, I will send so I know there's going to be a follow-up email that goes out. We do have a YouTube video on how to create, like how to design cells that was done by Jim Garish. It's fantastic. So I'll send that resource on so it can be shared with everyone else after the webinar.
Thanks, Annalise. Can you tell us a little bit more about Maya grazing? And do you work up in Canada? You are that far into the US, but
yeah,
we're Canadian producers.
Yep. So I'm an honorary Canadian. No. Yeah. So my territory is all of North America. We have several ranchers and graziers north of the border. So Maya Grazing, what it is, it's a planned grazing management application. And so what it does is it helps farmers and ranchers in all different types of contexts to manage their forage and their cattle inventories to extend their grazing season. So there is a forecasting tool that allows you to forecast that long-term stocking rates, your carrying capacity. We have growing season grazing plan tools, non-growing season grazing plan tools. There are also opportunities for independent or personalized mentorship opportunities. So when you onboard with our company, you actually work directly with people. We help you set up your account. We train you to use the program. We help you achieve the outcomes that you're looking for based on your context. So both short and long-term goals for your company. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Absolutely. I am going to just put in the chat there, if you have a desire to take a look at anything, I don't know if I can put it in the chat. If you have a desire for a product tour, I will send information on for you guys to book with one of our salespeople as well. So.
And did we have any other questions, Pam, or is that covered?
that covers it for now, Sean.
Sean,
well,
you're no longer sharing your screen.
Okay. I'm just going to pull up the next presentation. So that'll be great to share that YouTube video with Jim Garish and for the participants. We will be sending out a survey following today's Stock Talk to all the participants, the ones that are on live as well as the ones that weren't able to join us live. So the next topic is annual forages for Greenfeed, silage, and fall grazing. Vet carried out some annual forage trials last year and in both 21 and 22 across several sites across the province with the dry conditions in recent years, which reduced perennial forage production. There is an increased need for annual forage production for feed for livestock. So the objective of the annual forage trials is to test various varieties of annual crops for forage yield and quality at 5 sites across Manitoba. So we tested oats, barley, peas, triticale, oats and peas, barley and peas, millet, and sorghum. So this was conducted at 4 diversification centers across Manitoba and at U of M's Carman research site. And then the results were shared in both Seed Manitoba and Manitoba Beef Producers Cattle Country. So if you're looking for all the nitty-gritty details, then you can look to either of those 2 sources. And the trials are co-sponsored by McVet, which is the Manitoba Crop Variety Evaluation Team, different seed companies, Manitoba Beef Producers, and Manitoba Ag. So when we look at the yield from the trials last year in 2022 and comparing it on a crop basis and not on a variety basis, we saw sorghum was the highest yielding crop by a considerable margin, and it produced almost 8 ton of dry matter per acre. The next was oats at just over 5. This was followed by spring triticale, just under 5 ton per acre, and barley came in at around 4.5. And then our pea cereal mixture was just over 4, and millet was just under 4. These are all the varieties and crops that were in the trial. So we had 5 barley, 3 oats, 2 sorghums, 2 millets, 1 spring triticale, and then an oat and pea mixture and a barley and pea mixture. But for today's presentation, I'm going to look at more of it on a crop basis than an individual basis. So when we were looking at relative feed value, barley had the highest relative feed value at 132 points. This is followed by the pea cereal mixture at 123. And then in the middle, fairly close together, was the spring triticale and the oats and the sorghum, ranging from 108 to 111. And then a little bit lower was millet, which averaged 99. Our highest protein, which isn't a surprise, was the pea cereal mixture, came in at just under 12%. And this was followed by barley, closer to 11, as was the oats. And then the triticale was closer to 10. And the lowest was sorghum at under 8%. And these are the averages across all the sites and all of the different varieties. When we look at the energy, barley had the highest energy at 67%. The pea cereal mixtures and sorghum were close at 63. The triticale at 62, and oats just over 61, and millet just under 61% TDN. So to summarize the annual forage trials, the highest overall yield belonged to sorghum. And sorghum being a long season crop, it's not surprising. It's similar to corn. It basically will grow for the entire grazing season. If you cut it, you can get 2 cuts. You can get regrowth from sorghum, but you do have to worry about prussic acid. Oats was second at 5.2 ton. Triticale was third, 4.7, and barley fourth at 4.5 ton of dry matter per acre. Barley had the highest overall relative feed value and energy, and the pea cereal mix had the highest protein and was second for relative feed value and energy. So I guess to justify why these trials were carried out, we had several years of dry conditions, and where we saw in Agro-Manitoba less than 50% precipitation through a number of the dry years, including 2018 and 2019, 2021 were some really dry years where forage production really suffered. And what happens when we have low precipitation, low forage production, those prices can be quite high. And that's if you can find forages to feed your livestock. So growing annual crops are beneficial in drier years because they are more moisture efficient. Corn is one of the most moisture efficient annual crops that you can grow. It requires just over 3 inches of precipitation per ton of dry matter. Barley requires just under 4. Oats is about 4 3/4. But compared to timothy or alfalfa, they require almost 7 inches of moisture to produce 1 ton of dry matter. So a drought management strategy for livestock producers can be including more annual crops in your rotation, because in dry years, your annual crops will still produce a reasonable yield compared to the perennial forages such as alfalfa, timothy, brome. They produce well in wet years, but in dry years, their yields really suffer. And then the other benefit of C4 plants like corn, sorghum, or millet, they're more water efficient and drought tolerant. So they do even better in those drier years compared to our cool season cereals like oats or barley. Early seeding generally results in higher yields, and this is true with Greenfeed and silage or grain production. So we'd like to be seeding in that May period if possible. Even in early June, we can still have a good expectation for a reasonable yield. As we get later into the growing season, our yields do drop off. But in years like last year where we had late seeding because of wet conditions, you can still get a reasonable Greenfeed or silage yield by seeding into that later June period with some of the early maturing crops, such as barley or prosa millet, which you can cut after about 65 to 70 days of growth. Annuals can be used for grazing, and annual crops seeded can be grazed 4 to 6 weeks after the seeding time. If you seed a winter cereal in the fall time, you can get some really early spring grazing. So often that will be one of the first crops to green up in the springtime, well ahead of the perennial forages. Spring cereals produce lots of volume of growth in the spring also, and then the production drops off through the summer. A way of increasing that forage production later into the fall period is including cover crops, some brassicas, some legumes in with those spring cereals. Another option is seeding your fall cereal with a spring cereal. The fall cereal will stay vegetative the year that it's seeded, where the spring cereal, you get such long days and good growing in June that it's tough to keep that spring cereal vegetative. And once it turns reproductive, get to that boot stage, you're going to get very little regrowth out of that spring cereal. Seed it together and cut for silage. That fall cereal will then regrow in the late summer, early fall for that fall grazing. And that's all moisture contingent. So annuals work well for silage and can be chopped or baled as silage, or they also make really good green feed. And there's a couple of reasons why annuals make very good silage is they have high sugar content, and you need the sugars to drive the fermentation process. Barley, oats, corn is naturally higher in sugars compared to our perennials, such as alfalfa or timothy or brome, which have lower sugar content, and you need those sugars for effective and good fermentation to make good silage. Another reason why the annuals work better for making into silage is they have lower calcium levels, so they have a lower buffering capacity. Alfalfa legumes are naturally higher in calcium, and that causes a resistance and drop in pH. And so you need that drop in pH to have a well-preserved silage. So what stage of production should you be cutting your annuals at? For oats, we like to harvest at that late milk to early dough stage. Barley, you want to shoot for the soft dough to medium dough. Triticale soft dough, foxtail millet, or prosa, we want to look at early heading to mid heading. Peas, when the first pods are wrinkling, or pea cereal mixture, we shoot for that proper cereal stage. In hay and pastures, we want to include as much legumes as possible. This increases yield as well as the quality, the protein, and livestock gain. We want to include non-bloating legumes in pasture mixes. We're restricted in how much alfalfa we can have in our pasture mixes. So we want to include non-bloating legumes such as bird's foot trefoils, Seister milk vetch, or sandfoin. We want to ensure that it's properly inoculated with the correct rhizobia, because that really will affect how well those legumes produce. And if a stand is more than 50% legume, all the nitrogen can be provided to the grasses, and that helps keep fertilizer costs and greenhouse gas emissions down. We want to renovate older forage stands to maintain and improve forage production. This is a chart showing how the forage production will drop off after a few years of seeding. So you can still get pretty good production in the first 4 or 5 years before the production starts to decline. And that's why MESC has higher forage coverage for those younger stands, is because the yields are higher, so your coverage levels are higher through MESC. So that's another way of helping to drought-proof your forage production, is keeping your stands younger and renovating them on a consistent basis. We really saw the yields drop off on those older forage stands where there wasn't much legume. The fertility was dropping off, and those stands are the ones that really suffer in the dry conditions. So management farmers practice a number of different fall grazing options, whether it's stockpile grass, the grazing of the second or third cut, corn grazing, swath grazing, there's corn stover, stubble grazing, bale grazing, and others. So fall grazing is an opportunity to reduce your manure disposal costs. You can add nutrients to the land and cut winter feeding, and you can cut your yardage costs. So with that, we'll take some questions if there are any.
There's one question, Sean. It just says, so you're saying that you can seed winter wheat with oats in the spring and your winter wheat will still overwinter for growth next spring?
That's right. And by seeding your winter cereal in the spring, it's not going to head out the same as your spring cereal will. And so it'll stay vegetative that whole growing season, because it has to go through that fertilization period. So a period of colder temperatures to switch it from the vegetative to the reproductive stage. So yes, you can leave it until the following year and either graze it the following year, or then you can leave it and cut it for green feed or combine it. But I mean, grazing can cause some injury to it if you go overgraze it. So.
And that's all we have.
All right, well, thank you. And our next presentation will be by Pam Iwachesko, who's a forage and livestock specialist in Dauphin, and she's going to provide us with some pasture management tips. So Pam, bring up your slides.
Can you see them?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Sean said, I'm just going to share a few quick tips and tricks and points in pasture management that maybe will assist you in the upcoming grazing season. And this is sort of based on some principles that were practiced at our planned grazing project that we had over a period of 6 years at the MBFI research farm in Brandon, north of Brandon. So just going to share a couple of those scenarios. So basically, you know, when we're talking about good pasture management, the overall question is why. And I guess the key point or principle is that we want to set goals that are not only just in terms of production management for the cows, because we always definitely want to see, you know, heavyweight calves coming off of those cows, healthy heavyweight calves coming off in the fall, and cows that are coming off in good condition, but also in terms of the landscape. So a lot of farmers and ranchers nowadays are definitely conservation orientated. They're practicing beneficial management practices or implementing them on their operations with the goal of having good conservation management in mind. And with that, you know, they practice some of the points that I'm going to be talking about today. And that's things like following concepts of what we know sort of as historical grazing, when the bison roamed the plains. You know, they did a short intense graze, and then they never came back to that area. There was long periods of rest and recovery. And that, if anything, is the point that I want to make today, is that rest and recovery is, you know, the number one essential thing that all producers should be having in the back of their mind when they're grazing their animals. So the whole process of grazing management comes down to moving the animals, like Annalise said, either on a daily basis or every 3 days, whatever works, but allowing lots of rest and recovery for the forage plants that we're utilizing. And we just have to recognize that having good grazing management is a really powerful tool in terms of improving the resilience of the land. And now that we're experiencing lots of environmental extremes, lots of flash flooding, lots of heat extremes, it's really important that we make sure that the land is resilient and that it has a good, strong foothold, so that we're not washing away a lot of that topsoil and the nutrients available for the forage growth. The other thing, this is just a funny point that I wanted to include, is that it does make it easier on a marriage. So if you've got well-trained cows and they're psychologically trained to make sure that they know what an electric fence is, or a fence in general, you don't have to argue with your spouse. And you know, in many cases, in terms of practicing good grazing management, you don't have to worry about the cows running through the fence because the grass is greener on the other side. They're well trained and they'll wait to be moved on a daily basis or whatever it is, and you don't have to have that additional fight with your spouse. So basically, good grazing management has these key points in mind. When you're practicing good grazing management, you are increasing natural fertility. More importantly, you're increasing water infiltration because you don't have those bare patches of ground. You have green grass that's going through the process of photosynthesis. It's capturing energy from the sun for free. It's utilizing the nutrients in the soil. It's getting a good, strong hold with a good root system. And those roots are uptaking that moisture where it's being captured at the ground level. And so you're not getting a lot of the topsoil nutrients washed away like many other crop production systems. You're building and you're storing biological capital, and that's really, really important. And of course, the overall goal is to increase yields and productivity, thus increasing profitability. So this is one of our pictures that I took on the field trial at MBFI, and this was at the mid-June when things were just starting to grow in 2017. But in every consecutive year thereafter, 2018, 2019, 2020, we saw the exact same results, and this is on one side of the fence versus the other. And I can pretty much guarantee I know what every producer what their choice would be in terms of which pasture would you prefer. And so in our trial, we were basically trying to justify, you know, the advice that we've been giving for a number of years in terms of what type of grazing system you should be using. A, of course, is a continuous system where there's no rest and recovery, and the animals have access to those paddocks at all time during the grazing season. B is where we had a minimum of a 75-day rest period, and this was 2 years into our project. So the only difference here is a fence that separates these two paddocks. They were seeded down with the same exact species, and you can see through continuous grazing, what you're seeing is those bare patches. You're seeing lower productivity, you're seeing loss of productive species. And so it's quite evident over the 6 years that we did this trial, and that a picture is worth 1,000 words in terms of what you can see happening when you allow for that rest and recovery. So again, the number one message is to be subdividing those pastures as Annalie had talked about, and allowing for rest and recovery. And again, the other thing that we want to talk about when we're talking about forage productivity is the diversity of the species within the mixes, and that includes growth of a healthy soil system down below, and that's with the mycorrhizal fungi and soil microbes. That's what makes this whole system tick. It's definitely a very complicated system, which soil scientists are only beginning to evolve in terms of understanding the soil organisms down below, but the diversity of plants above and the diversity of the root systems below form this symbiotic relationship, and it helps build the soil health and the soil productivity. And in that regard, you're not losing soil organic matter, you're actually starting to develop it again. And in terms of pasture management and moving the animals, you're allowing the animals to do the work for you. You're training them to utilize the pastures more evenly. There's a more even distribution of livestock across the landscape. So you accomplish a lot more even distribution and even utilization of the pastures. There's way less underutilization in some areas or overutilization in others. So this was just what we had done for the 6 years that we did the trials. So the areas in the light green paddocks are the ones that we separated, and we further subdivided those into 1 acre pieces. We have 25 cow-calf pairs that moved on a daily basis, or sometimes every 2 or 3 days based on forage productivity. And we used the clip and weigh method here, which Annalise had talked about earlier, to measure forage productivity, and just subdivided the pastures based on what was there at a 50% utilization rate. And then the paddocks, which were basically identical in nature when we first started out on the pastures in terms of species composition. In red are the continuous pastures, and over the 6 years we saw a lot of succession in terms of weed infestations and different species taking over, not necessarily the tame species that we had planted to begin with. So again, the rest and recovery is key for the longevity of the species that you want to keep in the mix. And just an overview of what we did. Again, we had the 25 cow-calf pairs on the planned paddocks, moving them daily or every alternative day, and 25 cow-calf pairs on the continuous grazing system. And each had about approximately a total of 90 acres. And both pastures, again, contained the same species to begin with. Water accessibility, as Annalie had attributed to, was an overground pipeline where we put in spigots, and then we placed portable water troughs. As the cattle moved, we moved the water troughs because we had accessibility to water in all of the planned paddocks. So it was definitely a great system to have in terms of accessibility to water and just ease of movement whenever we needed to move the cattle to a different paddock. One of the things that we definitely noticed was a lot more bare ground on the continuous pastures. We had that infestation of weeds, absinthe, and dandelion, and a lot less productivity on the tame species. As you can see, this picture was taken on May 24th. In 2018, again, in consecutive years, we see the exact same thing. So if we did have alfalfa species in the mix on the continuous side, it was about 7 inches tall. On the continuous side, on the same exact day, it was at 24 or 13 inches in height. So definitely significant differences in terms of productivity with the species that we wanted to see, other species that we didn't want to see. We like taking fence line contrast pictures. So on the continuous side, on July 3rd of 2018, you can see how hammered down that side is versus the planned where the alfalfa is blooming, and it's a lot more productive in terms of yield. Again, in 2020, the continuous side has a lot more grass species creeping in, not a lot of alfalfa, and that alfalfa and some of those legumes are still in the mix and quite a healthy stand. So certainly we're seeing, again, significant differences just in terms of what you can see with your naked eye. And again, just based on a fence line. We used a lot of different tools which are available and are readily available, I think, for the most part, other than maybe extenuating circumstances like COVID and supply and demand. However, these tools, we took advantage of a lot of them, putting up some high tensile electric fence, which isn't all that hard to do, a couple of days, and you can put in some paddocks or exterior fencing. Again, things like the water lines to make water availability relatively easy. We have a solar pumping system that will allow accessibility to the whole entire farm from a very large slough at the north end of the paddocks. We've also used some solar powered electronic gate openers, and so when you set the time, you can, if you aren't going to be available on one day, you can set it so that the gate opens when you want it to, and the cows will obviously go to where the grass is greener. So these tools are relatively magical when labor is not as available as you might like it to be. Again, my number one message that I think many of us who were involved in this trial is that rest is the number one factor, and so continuous grazing does not allow for that. It's detrimental to pasture productivity, and just like you and I, and the animals, the grass is a living organism as well, the forages, and so they need rest and allow for accessibility to recovery as well. So that is the number one message that I think is key. The other one that we discovered sort of was that a key to grazing management is to start grazing at the 3-leaf stage, or the collared leaves, that you have 3 fully colored leaves, and that's on the grasses that are within the mix. So that's very, very important to start monitoring. We typically go out at the end of April, if applicable, if there's no snow, or the beginning of May, and start monitoring, and those animals are not put out onto those paddocks until the majority of the grasses in each of the paddocks is at the 3 collared leaf stage. So we've done a little bit of a YouTube video there, and if you take the time to watch that, it just showcases the importance of looking at plant physiology when you're practicing good grazing management as well. These are some of the results that we saw, and as you can see at the bottom of the chart there, we've got 1.28 animal units per acre in 2019, very similar numbers in 2020, but on the same number of acres, you can add all those up on A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and that's a total of 90 acres on all of those paddocks. And so we got a lot more animal unit acres out of those planned paddocks, moving those animals on a daily basis versus what we got on the continuous pasture. So consecutively over the 6 years, we got an additional 30 to 40 days extra grazing in terms of utilizing the pastures and trying to aim for that 50% residual left on the pastures. So again, I can't say enough about good grazing management and practicing planned grazing. And those are some of the tips and tricks that we learned over the 6 years. And again, same thing with the residual. These are just some measurements that we took. We took a lot of different peak measurements during mid-season. We took some at the beginning of grazing to see what our forage availability was like and whether or not it would meet the forage demand based on the animal numbers we had out there. And then we took some at the end when we were finished grazing. And as you can see, on the planned grazing, we certainly had a lot of residual left because we always aimed for that 90% versus the continuous where, we'd take them off But there was just zero regrowth always on the continuous side because those plants had just become exhausted in terms of exhausting the root reserves and trying to regrow late in the fall before the winter season had snuck in. So there is a lot of programming out there, as Sean had mentioned, for grazing management. The one big one is the one that's called the Prairie Watershed Climate Program. This one allows support of $13,000 per quarter to a maximum of $50,000. They will support watering systems as well, up to $2,000 per quarter for stationary water system development and $7,000 for mobile water systems. They're also paying for improving pasture composition, so some improving forages within existing stands, and they will also help with some grazing management mentorship, or if you would like to hire a grazing mentor to help you. It's always good to have a second set of eyes when developing grazing management plans. So again, this is some programming that is here and now, and there will be some more programming coming through our department, and that support will be on some of the Crown lands, I believe. So, or if you don't fall within a watershed district. So take advantage of these programs. It helps to cover off some of the initial capital costs and helps you establish a good grazing management strategy on your own operations. So with that, that's all I have.
Thanks, Pam. I'd like to thank both Pam and Annalise for their pasture and forage management presentations. And Pam can be found at the Dauphin Manitoba Agriculture office during the day. I'm just going to share my screen here. Just not sure if you had any questions there, Pam, or not come in. So just had a few more slides to wind up today's Stock Talk. If we look at the
Sean, your screen is not up yet. There we go. And just
you
play.
can see calf insurance.
Yeah, just need to put it in presentation mode. Perfect.
All right, so the calf insurance that's still available until June. We've seen the premiums come down a little bit from last month, and their prices have stayed quite strong. For the October insurance period, you can insure up to $318 per hundredweight. This is for 6-weight steers. And then in November, you can get a top price of $310. So still some really strong insurance prices available. That reflects the strong feeder market and livestock cattle markets that we've been seeing as of late. This winter has been quite dry. We're at less than 50% precipitation across most of Agro-Manitoba. And in some areas, it's even less than this. Where in Gladstone, we're sitting at 36%. This is from beginning of November till April the 10th. Holland, we're at 34, Arborg 29%, Toulon 19%, and Neepawa 25%. So even though it looks like there's a bit of moisture around, we're still down quite a bit through the winter period. But our temperatures have been a little bit below normal. And from this map here, we have averaged anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees below normal on the western part of the province, eastern part of the province, closer to normal, or 1 degree above. So most of the province below normal this past winter. I've had some reports of deer damage on stored feed. So there is a wildlife damage compensation program where producers can get compensation for either crops damaged by wildlife in the field or from stored feed that's been damaged. And so contact your nearest MSC office for more information and to have an adjuster come out to evaluate how much damage there was. We have a number of forage and livestock specialists across the province, so feel free to contact any one of them in either Dauphin, where Pam's located, Roblin, Killarney, Beausejour, Arborg, or myself in Portage. And if you need to get in touch with MESC, there's 10 locations across Manitoba. You can track down a lending rep or a crop insurance agent for any of your lending or insurance needs. And that concludes today's Stock Talk. I'd like to encourage you to complete the survey when we send it out. That'll help us to plan future Stock Talks starting in the fall time. So I'd like to thank you for joining and have a good growing season.